Yeah, hello everybody. I'm Paul Welfens, the president of the European Institute for International Economic Relations at the University of Rotterdam. In 2019, I published a book, Climate Change Policy. The German title was Klimaschutzpolitik. And the book is also available in English and French, and also a Chinese summary version is available soon. So we all are interested to understand how could we achieve climate neutrality by 2050 in an efficient way. And there have been discussions, for instance, in Germany and some EU countries, that alternatives are CO2 tax on the one hand, or CO2 allowance pricing and an emission trading system respectively on the other hand. So in the case of the EU, we can say that since 2005 we have an emission trading system. It works. It covers energy and industry, roughly 45% of CO2 emissions. Other countries, other regions have imitated this system successfully and performed even better. So just take a look at California. They started in 2012, and then in 2015 they broadened the coverage of CO2 emissions, and they are close to 80%, or they have a bit more than 80% in 2021, and this is quite interesting to see what actually then is the result when we ask, okay, what is the price of an emission certificate of a CO2 allowance? And the price per ton in California in 2021 was close to 18 euro per ton of CO2, and in the EU the price was around 50 euro. Closely it reached 55 euro per ton. And of course every economist, many business people, and obviously also many taxpayers and politicians will ask, okay, what was this transatlantic price difference? And the answer of the economist is simply to say, okay, you can get here enormous gains from trade, just integrate the system of California, so the emission trading system of California with the emission trading system of the EU. Okay, it would probably be wise to have at first an increase in the coverage of the EU emission trading system, so that we would be close also to 80% just as in California. And even more interestingly, China has started mid-July 2021 its own emission trading system. Okay, covers only the energy sector, but it's about 40% of China's CO2 emissions. The initial price, let's say in the first months of CO2 allowance trading, was around 7 euro per ton of CO2. Again, the perspective in the medium term is just wonderful in the sense that, let's say, if we could achieve that every G20 country had its own national emission trading system, this would be stage one. And then in stage two, we would integrate all the national emission trading systems to have just one integrated G20 CO2 emission trading system. So that means there would be, let's say, just one world market price. There would be enormous benefits for every country. And just let's go back for a second to maybe this idea to integrate California and the EU. If we integrate these two emission trading systems, we would end up with a transatlantic CO2 price of about 35 euro. And that means, of course, that the EU countries would import CO2 allowances from California. Firms in California would sell CO2 allowances. So if this would apply to the whole US, then of course the implication is that the US current account deficit all of a sudden is no longer negative, or certainly improves very much, because the US would sell many CO2 allowances, and they can do so because the marginal cost of reducing CO2 emissions in the US and certainly in California is much lower than in the EU. This reflects the relative superior innovation performance of US firms here. The climate doesn't care where the savings of CO2 emissions come from. Is this from Europe, from the US, from China, from India, from Indonesia, and so on and so on. Now, the point was the G20 countries, I think this is very important, because I think it's unrealistic to focus, let's say, on 195 countries or so, which have all signed the UN Paris Climate Convention in 2015. Instead, just let's think back for a second. We had the ozone layer problem, as many of you will remember. And this means we had problems with fluorocarbon hydrogen emissions. And when 24 countries plus the EU signed the so-called Montreal Protocol, okay, this was a rather limited number of countries, which said, okay, let's substitute this fluorocarbon hydrogen by something which doesn't damage our ozone layer. And so it happened, and in the end, of course, all the other UN member countries also came on board. So the transaction costs and was all the negotiations are, of course, much smaller if you have a rather limited number of countries. But we have to add one additional thought in this pandemic situation of 2021. And this is a new proposal which I'm making here. Think of a country such as Indonesia, a G20 country, 270 million people. They would need a little bit more than 500 million doses of vaccination. And there is, I think, the challenge for the Western countries, let's say for the G7 countries, that governments should jointly buy critical corona vaccination patents. So I'm talking about, there would be a price for these patents. And then we could organize rather easily that newly industrializing countries, other G20 countries, and maybe even some developing countries would produce their own vaccine on the basis of licenses, right? So why is this so important? Because without such an arrangement, we already can understand now in 2021, let's say that now in summer, in early autumn 2021, we already are seeing the peak of economic recovery in the world economy. And this is rather weak for an economic upswing. The reason for this, to a large extent, is that very modest corona vaccination progress in Asian countries, in Africa and parts of Latin America, this is all bad for health, this is bad for the population, and this is very bad for the economic recovery in these countries. And therefore it is bad for the whole world economy. So we have a pandemic situation. I would say we have twice a global challenge. So one is overcoming the pandemic and the other is overcoming the climate crisis. Now, if we would help newly industrializing countries to get a much faster vaccination rate, and we can do this. We the Western countries can easily do this. This is a win-win situation for us if we would organize, and that, as I said, G7 countries would buy the corona patents, and then we would have the next step. Okay, you get more vaccinations, you get a much stronger economic upswing, and this then reduces the resistance in newly industrializing countries, in G20 countries, in critical G20 countries, to introduce an emission trading system. If the post-corona economic recovery is rather weak, let's say at the moment in Indonesia, then the government and also the business community typically will say, we do not want to introduce an emission trading system, even if it is a great idea per se. But all we understand is that in the first stage, we will witness higher production costs, because at least many firms will have to buy CO2 allowances. And if we want that emission trading systems are spreading quickly across G20, well, then here is the key. Okay, there is one country where we might need a second key, and this is India. The Indian government has held for many years the view that it would only be fair if, let's say, India would be allowed to have as many CO2 emissions in the coming 2 or 3 decades as the US has had in the past 200 years during its industrialization, modernization, and so on. And this, of course, is a position I think other G20 countries or the world economy cannot really accept. But we can, of course, offer some compensation to India. We can say, okay, let's make a package deal. Do not forget, okay, India is very much a country where energy is based on coal. So it's therefore very CO2 intensive. That's very bad for the climate. But at the same time, India is the number 5 among the users of solar energy. So India is advanced in certain fields of technology, no doubt about this. They're great in software, ICT, and in solar cell production. So the US, the EU, Japan, we can all offer, we can open our markets to a large extent to Indian exporters of solar technology, okay, on the condition that India quickly introduces its emission trading system. We could also maybe have some joint projects. Think of the EU and India, and we have some big solar projects, for instance, in Africa, which are based on a joint project approach. As regards Germany, the EU, often it is argued these are rather small countries. Germany represents 2% of world CO2 emissions, the EU just a little bit less than 10%. So where is the impact of Europe? Naturally, it's small, but that's not correct. I mean, first we can develop some good models which inspire other countries to follow suit, and the European emission system, the European emission trading system is really great. Okay, we were too slow in expanding the coverage of CO2 emissions trading. So the European Commission has now said that that fuels used in the field of transportation and real estate, housing, and so on. So this should all be part of a broader emission trading system by 2026. At the moment, we have, for instance, in Germany, CO2 taxes in real estate. Does this make sense? Okay, even if the CO2 price is increasing over time, I think yes and no. And the answer here is found in Japan. So now Japan's regions, in this case, there are two regions, namely Tokyo and the neighboring province Saitama. They were just great. They were very successful in establishing a regional CO2 emission trading system in the field of commercial real estate. So think of these office buildings, skyscrapers in Tokyo, and you can think about heating, you can think about lighting, you can think about climate devices, and the enormous cap which was set in the case of Tokyo and Saitama was minus 8%. So this means, the whole idea of an emission trading system always is this: you have a politically determined reduction rate per year, in this case minus 8%, which sounds to me to be very ambitious. And it is a big success story in the sense that this was implemented. This could be realized by the commercial real estate sector. Very successful, very powerful, very innovative, just great. Now, in the EU, I think, we can do basically the same, but I emphasize in commercial real estate. Do not forget that CO2 emission prices, they can have a lot of volatility. Okay, if you are a company, you're always used to deal with volatile input prices, and can be oil and gas prices or the price of CO2 allowances. Now, if you are a private household, I mean, we do not want, I think, that private households all of a sudden witness an increase of rent payments by 15% during the year just because the CO2 allowance price has increased very much. So here, I think, in private and residential real estate, one should rely on CO2 taxes, which over time can, of course, increase. And you still can determine now that you want to then recycle much or most or all of the CO2 tax revenue to the population. So yes, CO2 allowances, CO2 emission trading systems in G20, this is the key to achieving global climate neutrality by 2050 or maybe 2040. That's possible. If you want to achieve this, you should, on the other hand, not be, let's say, too modest in the reduction rate, which is determined by policymakers. For instance, in Europe, we are at minus 2.25%, which is definitely not enough. But as I said, we could, for instance, integrate California or say the US, if the US finally comes on board here, Europe and China, and maybe Korea and others. And then there would be an annual reduction rate of -4%. So make sure that you are not very modest in the 2020s, and then you need a very high reduction rate of maybe -8 or 9% in the 2040s and 50s, which would be a self-inflicted unnecessary economic shock. Okay, we have 3 decades roughly to achieve climate neutrality, and this is possible. We should be interested to achieve it at minimal cost, so that means in an efficient way. Those who refuse to consider emission trading systems actually would be responsible for unnecessarily high cost of CO2 reduction, and that means lower global output growth. This means that you will witness much more poverty, much more hunger, and many more, maybe millions of starved people in the south of this world economy. And definitely this is not what we want. We want to achieve the global climate change in a timely way at minimal cost, and also without destabilizing the world economy and without getting households, private households, which are upset because all of a sudden there is a dramatic increase of their rent bill. Okay, so that all means we can be optimistic, provided that the Biden administration and any other administration in the US following in the future is really willing to consider cooperation with China in the field of climate neutrality, policy. I think it's absolutely unrealistic to expect that this planet can achieve climate neutrality by 2050 if there is no cooperation between the US and China and the EU. If there would be permanent trade wars between the US and China, it's very difficult to imagine that there would be an integration of the Chinese and the US and the EU emission trading system. Okay, so this I think is a very important perspective, and I think it's also useful if the Europeans would encourage the Biden administration to simply implement nationally or in many US states what California already has achieved as a great model in its emission trading system. For a short time, there was actually also a cooperation between California and the Canadian state of Ontario. So this just shows you can wonderfully integrate cross-border emission trading systems, both sides benefits, and it was only for political reasons that the Canadian province, roughly I would say after a year, was arguing, no, we think emission trading is not really good, and it's also not sure whether we have a climate problem or not. I think the scientific evidence is clear. We have a global climate problem, which is serious. But we have a lot of experience in global cooperation in other fields. I mentioned the ozone layer problem, the ozone hole problem. And here we were successful all together, and we have to do the same in a bigger effort, of course, with climate neutrality. And if we had G20 emission trading systems internationally fully integrated, there were enormous, there would be enormous benefits from trade. Yeah, the US current account would improve very much. And there is all reason to be optimistic, actually, that we will not witness an ever increasing price of CO2 allowances, for instance, in Europe. We simply have to cooperate with other countries. We should let markets work, with one caveat. I mean, we should not be unrealistic. That's never a good idea in life. Of course, if you have emission trading systems working in G20, you can be sure these will be big markets. There will be future markets on CO2 allowances. There will be big derivative markets. And the only thing we do not want is to get the next global financial crisis emerging here from CO2 allowance markets. So actually, we need new financial regulation in this field, and we really should have learned the lessons from the transatlantic banking crisis. Here, I'm not so sure that this has been the case so far. And just to give you one example, the issue of how to get adequate ratings. We know there were a lot of inflated AAA ratings in 2007, 2006, and so on. And in a period where risk premium should have increased, the risk premiums fell due to sloppy rating agencies doing not their proper work. So I have proposed twice, a couple of years ago, that one should have rating systems which work in a two-stage way and actually establish a kind of a public good signal, in the sense that, let's say, we have several companies or countries interested in ratings, and then we would organize a pool financing. So every country, every company who wants a rating, okay, you will be part of the pool. You have no direct business connection with the rating companies. It's the pool company, or there could be maybe 2 or 3 pool companies. They have then a contract which says, okay, we need 3,420 ratings for these companies, banks, and so on this year. And then each company, each bank would have to pay the bill on a pro rata basis, and thereby you would get efficient rating systems. This again is also very important. So what we have learned, so to speak, today is we should combine the overcoming of the pandemic with the climate change problem, or the establishing of a G20 ETS system. And we also need a better, more intelligent, more efficient rating system. So in the end, all the people in this world can be jointly successful. We can achieve climate neutrality by 2045 or maybe 2040. This is a big challenge. It's an intellectual, political challenge. And I think all the ingredients for success are on the table. And I'm very much encouraging policymakers and my fellow economists, but also taxpayers all around the world and the business community to push for what is an efficient solution which will work. So this has been one of the contributions here from the European Institute for International Economic Relations. We very much encourage you to take a closer look at our publications. So we are a private research institute, a non-profit research institute, active for more than 25 years now. You'll find, I think, some great research papers on our website. It's www.eiiw.eu, and you can also find a lot of books published in several languages on such issues as the global Trump, the automotive industry. Yeah, there's a topic like an accidental Brexit, which of course is on the Brexit. And I very much recommend our working paper series. I'm quite pleased that we could publish recently a paper which I have written together with Werner Röber, and is first the SGE macro model with foreign direct investment, multinational companies, which of course are important. And it also takes a look actually at both process and product innovations and various standard shocks, which we typically consider in macroeconomics. Thank you very much.